The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Camilla walked through the grand corridors she had called home for the past 15 years. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ornate walls, each sound seeming to carry the weight of memories that now felt distant and fragile. She paused before the large window overlooking the palace gardens, watching as groundskeepers tended to the roses that had always brought her such joy. Camilla had never imagined this day would come. When she first arrived at the palace as a young woman, full of hope and dreams, she believed she was stepping into a fairy tale. The royal family had welcomed her with open arms, or so it seemed. She had married Prince Edward, the king's younger brother, in a ceremony that captured the hearts of millions around the world. The media had celebrated their love story, calling it a modern-day romance between a commoner and a prince. Those early years had been magical. Camilla had thrown herself into royal duties with enthusiasm and grace. She visited hospitals, supported charities, and represented the crown at various functions. The public adored her warm smile and genuine compassion for others. She had a natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life, whether she was comforting sick children in hospital wards or speaking with elderly residents at care homes. Her marriage to Edward had produced two beautiful children, Princess Alexandra and Prince William. Alexandra, now 14, had inherited her mother's kind heart and her father's adventurous spirit. She excelled in her studies and showed a particular interest in environmental conservation. Young William, only 12, was a bright and curious boy who loved history and often spent hours in the palace library reading about ancient civilizations. The family had lived a relatively quiet life within the palace walls, away from the constant scrutiny that plagued other members of the royal family. Edward had always been content to remain in the background, supporting his older brother the king while pursuing his passion for archaeology. He often traveled to excavation sites around the world, and Camilla had frequently accompanied him, turning these trips into educational adventures for their children. But everything began to change 3 years ago when King Charles III passed away unexpectedly. Edward's older brother, Prince Henry, ascended to the throne as King Henry IX. The transition had initially seemed smooth, and Camilla had hoped that their family's position within the royal hierarchy would remain stable. She had always maintained a cordial relationship with Henry, though she had noticed over the years that he could be somewhat cold and calculating in his approach to royal matters. The first signs of trouble came in the form of subtle changes in protocol. Invitations to state dinners became less frequent. Their children were no longer included in certain royal photographs. Edward began to notice that he was being excluded from important family discussions and decision-making processes. When he raised these concerns with his brother, Henry dismissed them as necessary adjustments to streamline royal operations. Camilla tried to maintain a positive outlook, believing that these changes were temporary growing pains as the new king established his reign. She continued her charitable work with renewed vigor, hoping to prove her value to the royal family. She launched several successful initiatives, including a program to provide education opportunities for underprivileged children and a campaign to raise awareness about mental health issues. However, the situation continued to deteriorate. Palace staff who had been loyal friends for years began to treat Camilla and her family with a noticeable distance. Longtime employees were transferred to other departments or quietly dismissed altogether. The head butler, James, who had been with the family since Alexandra was born, approached Camilla one evening with tears in his eyes to inform her that he had been given notice. The media began to pick up on the tension within the royal family, though they could only speculate about the true nature of the problems. Tabloid headlines started questioning Edward's relevance to the modern monarchy. Opinion pieces suggested that the royal family needed to be smaller and more focused, implying that certain members were expendable. Camilla found herself walking on eggshells, carefully considering every word and action to avoid giving King Henry any reason to view her family as problematic. She noticed that Edward was becoming increasingly withdrawn and frustrated. Their once happy marriage began to show signs of strain as they struggled to navigate the uncertain political landscape within their own family. The breaking point came 6 months ago during a family gathering at Balmoral Castle. What was supposed to be a peaceful summer retreat turned into a nightmare when King Henry announced his intention to modernize the monarchy. He spoke of reducing the number of working royals and cutting costs associated with maintaining multiple royal households. While he didn't explicitly name Edward's family, the implications were clear. That evening, Camilla overheard a heated argument between the two brothers. Edward was pleading with Henry to reconsider, explaining that their family had always served the crown faithfully and effectively. Henry's response was cold and final. He spoke of the need to make difficult decisions for the good of the monarchy, regardless of personal feelings or family loyalty. When Edward returned to their room that night, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. He sat on the edge of their bed and took Camilla's hands in his. With a voice barely above a whisper, he told her that they needed to prepare for significant changes. He couldn't bring himself to explain the full extent of what Henry had told him, but Camilla could see the devastation in his eyes. The weeks that followed were filled with tense meetings and difficult conversations. Lawyers were consulted, though discreetly. Financial advisors were brought in to discuss the family's options outside of royal patronage. Edward explored the possibility of returning to his academic career, while Camilla researched ways to continue her charitable work as a private citizen. Throughout this ordeal, they tried to shield their children from the worst of the situation. Alexandra and William knew that something was wrong, but their parents maintained the facade that everything was under control. Family dinners became strained affairs where everyone pretended that life was normal, while the adults carefully avoided discussing anything related to their uncertain future. The palace staff who remained loyal to the family began to provide subtle warnings about upcoming changes. The head gardener mentioned that he had been asked to prepare inventory lists of personal belongings in their quarters. The children's tutor quietly informed Camilla that she had been told to wrap up the current curriculum earlier than usual. Camilla spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how their lives had changed so dramatically. She thought about all the years she had dedicated to serving the crown, all the sacrifices she had made, and all the genuine good she believed their family had accomplished. The unfairness of their situation felt overwhelming, but she knew she had to remain strong for her children and husband. As autumn approached, the pressure intensified. King Henry's advisors began making more direct inquiries about the family's plans. Edward was given increasingly vague responses when he asked about upcoming royal engagements. The children's schedules were quietly modified to exclude certain traditional activities and lessons. One particularly difficult evening, Princess Alexandra approached her mother with tears in her eyes. She had overheard some of her classmates discussing rumors about their family's status within the royal hierarchy. The intelligent teenager had pieced together enough information to understand that something serious was happening, though she didn't know the full extent of the situation. Camilla held her daughter close and tried to provide reassurance while being honest about the uncertainty they faced. She explained that sometimes families go through difficult periods, but that didn't change how much they loved each other. Alexandra's maturity and strength in that moment made Camilla incredibly proud, but it also broke her heart to see her child dealing with such adult concerns. The formal notice came on a gray October morning. A palace official arrived at their quarters with an official document bearing King Henry's seal. Edward received the visitor in his study, while Camilla waited anxiously in the sitting room. When Edward emerged 20 minutes later, his face told her everything she needed to know. The document outlined the royal family's decision to restructure living arrangements within the various palaces. Edward's family would need to vacate their quarters within 60 days. They would retain their titles, but would no longer be considered working members of the royal family. Their allowances would cease, and they would be responsible for their own security and housing arrangements. The clinical language of the official notice couldn't mask the personal devastation of its contents. Camilla read through the document several times, trying to process the reality of their situation. After 15 years of loyal service, they were being dismissed like employees whose positions had become redundant. Edward immediately began making phone calls to lawyers and financial advisors, trying to understand their legal options and plan for their family's future. Camilla walked through their home, looking at the photographs, artwork, and personal items they had collected over the years. Everything would need to be packed and moved. But where would they go? The next few weeks passed in a blur of difficult decisions and painful conversations. They had to tell the children the truth about their situation. They had to inform the charitable organizations they worked with about their changing circumstances. They had to face the media speculation and public scrutiny that inevitably followed any major change in royal arrangements. Through it all, Camilla tried to maintain her dignity and grace. She continued attending scheduled engagements until they were officially canceled. She worked with her staff to ensure that ongoing charitable projects would continue under new leadership. She helped her children process their emotions and adjust to the reality that their lives were about to change dramatically. But, beneath her composed exterior, Camilla was struggling with feelings of betrayal, loss, and uncertainty. The palace had been more than just a home. It had been the center of their identity and purpose. Now they faced an uncertain future outside the protective walls that had sheltered and defined them for so many years. The countdown to their departure had begun, and, with each passing day, the weight of their situation pressed more heavily upon Camilla's shoulders. The 60-day notice period that had once seemed like plenty of time now felt impossibly short as they faced the enormous task of dismantling 15 years of their lives within the palace walls. Camilla found herself waking earlier each morning, unable to sleep as her mind raced with endless lists of things that needed to be done. She would walk through the quiet corridors before dawn, taking in every detail of the home she was about to lose. The way the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows in the chapel, the familiar creak of the floorboard outside Alexandra's room, the scent of polish on the wooden banisters that had been maintained by generations of palace staff. The practical aspects of moving were overwhelming enough, but the emotional toll was even more challenging. Every room held precious memories of her children growing up, of quiet family moments, of celebrations, and milestones that had shaped their lives together. Packing these memories into boxes felt like dismantling her very identity. Edward had thrown himself into the logistics of their departure with characteristic determination. He spent long hours on the phone with estate agents, trying to find suitable housing for their family. The challenge was finding something that would provide adequate security while being affordable on their drastically reduced income. They could no longer rely on palace security or the comprehensive support system they had taken for granted for so many years. Their financial situation was more precarious than many people realized. While they had always lived comfortably, the royal allowance had covered most of their expenses. Edward's personal savings were modest, and Camilla had never had an independent income. The prospect of supporting a family of 4, including 2 children in private schools, on a limited budget was daunting. The children were handling the transition differently. Alexandra had initially responded with anger, demanding to know why their uncle was treating them so unfairly. She had always been close to King Henry, and couldn't understand how family relationships could become so cold and calculating. Her teenage sense of justice was outraged by what she saw as a betrayal of everything she had been taught about family loyalty and duty. William, being younger, was more confused than angry. He kept asking when they would be coming back to the palace, unable to fully grasp that this departure was permanent. He worried about his friends at school and whether he would still be able to participate in the activities he enjoyed. The uncertainty was particularly hard for a child who thrived on routine and stability. Camilla spent countless hours talking with both children, trying to help them process their emotions while managing her own grief and anxiety. She emphasized that their family's love and bond remained strong regardless of where they lived. She tried to frame their departure as an adventure rather than an exile, though she wasn't always convinced by her own optimism. The palace staff who had served the family faithfully for years were also struggling with the transition. Many of them had formed genuine friendships with Camilla and Edward, and they felt torn between their loyalty to the family and their need to maintain their positions within the royal household. Some staff members quietly expressed their disagreement with the king's decision, though they had to be careful not to be seen as disloyal. Mrs. Henderson, the children's nanny who had been with the family for 8 years, was particularly devastated. She had watched Alexandra and William grow from small children into bright, capable young people. The thought of not being part of their daily lives anymore brought tears to her eyes. Camilla spent a difficult afternoon helping Mrs. Henderson pack her personal belongings while they both tried to maintain their composure. The head chef, Marcus, had served the family since their wedding day. He knew everyone's favorite meals and had created countless special birthday cakes and celebration dinners. As he cleaned out his kitchen workspace, he left behind detailed recipe cards for all the family's favorite dishes, hoping that wherever they went, someone would be able to recreate the comfort foods that had brought them joy over the years. As word of their departure spread beyond the immediate palace staff, Camilla began receiving letters and phone calls from people whose lives had been touched by her charitable work. Hospital administrators wrote to express their gratitude for her years of support and their sadness at her departure. Teachers from schools she had visited sent cards signed by entire classes of children who wanted to thank her for her kindness and encouragement. These expressions of support provided some comfort to Camilla, reminding her that her years of service had made a real difference in people's lives. However, they also highlighted what she was losing. Without her official royal status, she would no longer have the same platform or resources to help others. The charitable organizations that had benefited from her patronage would need to find new sources of support and visibility. The media attention surrounding their departure was relentless and often painful. Photographers camped outside the palace gates, hoping to capture images of the family during this difficult time. Tabloid newspapers speculated about the reasons for their exile, often publishing inaccurate stories that painted either the family or King Henry in an unflattering light. Camilla had always maintained a dignified relationship with the press, understanding that media attention was part of royal life. However, the current coverage felt invasive and cruel. Reporters seemed to take pleasure in documenting their downfall, turning their personal tragedy into entertainment for the public. One particularly difficult morning, a photographer with a long telephoto lens captured images of Alexandra crying as she said goodbye to her horse at the palace stables. The pictures appeared on the front page of several newspapers under headlines that sensationalized a young girl's private moment of grief. Camilla was furious at this violation of her daughter's privacy, but there was little she could do except try to comfort Alexandra and help her understand that the attention would eventually fade. Edward's relationship with his brother had deteriorated completely. King Henry made no effort to see them before their departure, communicating only through official channels and palace staff. The man who had once been Edward's closest confidant and friend now treated him like a stranger. Family gatherings that had once been sources of joy and connection were no longer extended to them. The most painful aspect of this estrangement was its impact on the children's relationship with their extended family. Alexandra and William had grown up with their royal cousins, sharing holidays and family traditions. Now those relationships were complicated by the political dynamics within the family. Camilla worried about the long-term effects of these severed connections on her children's sense of identity and belonging. As their departure date approached, Camilla found herself making increasingly difficult decisions about what to take with them and what to leave behind. Many of their possessions technically belonged to the royal collection and would remain in the palace. Personal gifts from foreign dignitaries, artwork commissioned for their quarters, and even some furniture that had been specially made for their family had to be cataloged and left for the next occupants. The children's rooms were particularly heartbreaking to dismantle. Alexandra's walls had been covered with photographs from family trips, awards from school competitions, and artwork she had created over the years. William's room contained an extensive collection of history books and model airplanes that he had built with his father. Packing these cherished items felt like boxing up their childhood. Camilla spent one entire afternoon carefully wrapping and packing the family's photograph albums. Each image told a story of happier times, of family celebrations, and quiet moments of joy. She found pictures from their wedding day, from the children's christenings, from Christmas mornings, and summer vacations. Looking at these memories, it was hard to believe how dramatically their circumstances had changed. The practical arrangements for their new life were slowly falling into place, though not without challenges. Edward had secured a lease on a house in a quiet suburb outside London. It was comfortable, but modest compared to their palace quarters, with 4 bedrooms and a small garden. The children would need to change schools, as their current institutions were closely tied to the royal family and no longer appropriate for their circumstances. Security was a particular concern. As members of the royal family, they had always been protected by highly trained professionals who managed every aspect of their safety. Now they would need to arrange and pay for their own security, which would be much more limited. Edward had insisted on hiring at least one security professional, but they would need to adjust to a much more exposed way of life. The charitable organizations that Camilla had supported were working to arrange smooth transitions for her projects. Some initiatives would continue under new leadership, while others would be discontinued due to lack of resources. Camilla felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure that vulnerable people who had depended on these programs wouldn't be abandoned, but there was only so much she could do from her increasingly powerless position. One of the most difficult conversations was with the head of the Children's Hospital, where Camilla had been patron for over a decade. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had worked closely with Camilla on numerous fundraising campaigns and awareness initiatives. The hospital had benefited enormously from royal patronage, both in terms of funding and public profile. Dr. Mitchell was gracious and understanding, but Camilla could hear the disappointment in her voice as they discussed the transition. As the final weeks approached, palace officials began conducting formal inventories of their quarters. Strangers walked through their home, cataloging belongings and taking notes about necessary repairs or updates for future occupants. Camilla found these visits deeply invasive, but she had no choice but to cooperate. The message was clear: this was no longer their home, and they were merely temporary occupants awaiting removal. The children's last days at their current schools were filled with emotional farewells. Alexandra's best friend, Charlotte, was the daughter of another royal family member, and their friendship had been strained by the family politics surrounding their departure. The girls had grown up together, sharing secrets and adventures, but now their different positions within the royal hierarchy created an uncomfortable distance between them. William's teacher, Miss Roberts, privately expressed her sadness about his departure to Camilla. She described him as one of her most engaged and curious students, and she worried about how the transition would affect his academic progress and emotional well-being. She provided detailed notes about his learning preferences and suggested strategies for helping him adjust to his new school environment. The final month of their time at the palace brought an intensity of emotion that Camilla had never experienced before. Every day felt precious and painful at the same time, filled with last moments that she tried desperately to memorize and hold on to forever. The reality of their departure was no longer something distant to prepare for. It was an approaching inevitability that colored every interaction and every quiet moment. Camilla had developed a morning ritual during these last weeks. She would wake before dawn and walk through the palace gardens while the world was still quiet and peaceful. The roses she had helped plant years earlier were preparing for winter dormancy, their blooms fading but their roots strong beneath the soil. She found comfort in this metaphor, hoping that her family's roots were equally strong and would help them flourish wherever they eventually planted themselves. These early morning walks became a form of meditation and farewell combined. She would visit her favorite spots: the bench beneath the ancient oak tree where she used to read while the children played, the fountain where William had lost his first tooth and made a wish, the rose garden where she had posed for countless photographs over the years. Each location held layers of memories that she tried to imprint permanently in her mind. The complexity of their departure extended far beyond personal belongings and emotional farewells. Camilla had spent 15 years building relationships with staff members throughout the palace, from senior officials to gardeners and cleaning personnel. Many of these people had become genuine friends rather than simply employees, and saying goodbye to them was proving to be one of the most difficult aspects of leaving. Margaret, the elderly woman who had cleaned their quarters for 12 years, had become like a grandmother to Alexandra and William. She remembered their birthdays, their favorite snacks, and their childhood fears. When Margaret learned about the family's departure, she cried openly, telling Camilla that cleaning their rooms had been the highlight of her workdays. The genuine affection between them made their parting particularly heartbreaking. The palace's head librarian, Dr. Thornton, had been instrumental in fostering William's love of history. He had spent countless hours helping the young prince research various topics and had guided him through the palace's extensive historical archives. As a farewell gift, Dr. Thornton compiled a special collection of books about British history, carefully selected to continue William's education outside the palace walls. Edward was struggling with his own professional identity crisis. For 15 years, his role as a working royal had provided structure and purpose to his days. He had represented the crown at numerous functions, supported various organizations, and used his platform to promote causes he cared about deeply. Now he faced the prospect of starting over completely, building a new career and identity outside the royal system. His archaeological background provided some options, but returning to academic life after such a long absence would be challenging. Universities might be interested in his royal connections initially, but he would need to prove his scholarly credentials all over again. The prospect of competing for positions against younger academics who had maintained their research profiles throughout their careers was daunting. Camilla watched her husband grapple with these challenges and felt her own sense of helplessness. She had always been Edward's strongest supporter, but her ability to help him professionally was limited by her own uncertain circumstances. Her royal role had defined her adult life, and she wasn't sure what skills or experiences she could transfer to civilian life. The children's adjustment continued to be Camilla's primary concern. Alexandra had begun experiencing anxiety symptoms, including difficulty sleeping and changes in her appetite. The teenager was trying to maintain a brave facade, but Camilla could see through her daughter's careful composure to the fear and sadness beneath. Alexandra worried about fitting in at a new school where her classmates might judge her based on media coverage of their family's situation. William had become increasingly clingy, following Camilla around the palace and asking frequent questions about their future home. His young mind was struggling to process the permanence of their departure, and he repeatedly expressed hopes that King Henry would change his mind. Camilla found herself walking a difficult line between maintaining hope and helping him accept reality. The children's different coping mechanisms reflected their personalities and ages. Alexandra channeled her emotions into angry journal entries and intense physical exercise, running through the palace grounds until she was exhausted. William sought comfort in familiar routines and objects, sleeping with stuffed animals he had outgrown and insisting on the same bedtime stories he had loved as a younger child. Camilla arranged for both children to speak with a counselor who specialized in helping young people navigate major life transitions. Dr. Emma Williams had experience working with children from prominent families and understood the unique pressures they faced. Her sessions with Alexandra and William provided them with tools for managing their emotions and strategies for adapting to their new circumstances. The legal complexities of their departure required ongoing attention from Edward's solicitors. Questions about ongoing security arrangements, the children's education funding, and various financial obligations needed careful resolution. The royal family's lawyers were professional but distant, treating their departure as a business matter rather than a personal tragedy involving people they had known for years. One particularly challenging issue involved Camilla's patronages and charitable commitments. Some organizations wanted her to continue in an unofficial capacity, while others felt they needed the legitimacy that came with official royal patronage. Camilla had to navigate these delicate conversations while managing her own grief about losing this important aspect of her identity. The National Children's Hospital, where Camilla had served as patron for over a decade, was especially difficult to leave. She had developed close relationships with medical staff and had watched many children grow up through their treatment journeys. Dr. Mitchell, the hospital director, arranged a private farewell gathering where staff members and some families shared their appreciation for Camilla's years of support. During this emotional gathering, a young mother named Sarah approached Camilla with tears in her eyes. Her daughter Lucy had been battling leukemia for 3 years, and Camilla had visited her numerous times during treatment. Sarah explained that Camilla's visits had given Lucy strength and hope during the darkest periods of her illness. Lucy, now in remission, had drawn a picture for Camilla showing a princess and a little girl holding hands under a rainbow. These personal connections made leaving even more painful for Camilla. She wasn't just losing a title or a job. She was losing the ability to make a meaningful difference in people's lives in ways that she had found deeply fulfilling. The fear that she might never again have such opportunities to help others weighed heavily on her heart. As their departure date approached, media attention intensified rather than diminishing. Photographers and reporters seemed to be everywhere, documenting every aspect of their final days at the palace. The children couldn't play in the gardens without being photographed, and simple errands required careful planning to avoid unwanted attention. One morning, Camilla discovered that tabloid journalists had somehow obtained details about William's new school, including his enrollment date and class schedule. The prospect of her 12-year-old son being followed by photographers on his first day at a new school filled her with protective rage. Edward immediately contacted their security advisor and the school's administration to develop strategies for protecting William's privacy. The invasion of their privacy during this vulnerable time felt particularly cruel. Camilla understood that public interest in royal family changes was natural, but the level of intrusion into their children's lives seemed excessive and harmful. She worried about the long-term impact of this attention on Alexandra and William's emotional well-being and their ability to develop normal relationships outside the royal sphere. Palace staff members were also struggling with divided loyalties. Many of them disagreed privately with King Henry's decision, but couldn't express their opinions openly without risking their own positions. Camilla noticed the strain on their faces as they went about their duties, knowing that they were participating in something that felt wrong to them. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper who had overseen their quarters for 8 years, found creative ways to show her support without explicitly criticizing royal decisions. She ensured that Camilla's favorite flowers were always fresh in their rooms, that special meals were prepared for the children's comfort, and that small touches of extra care were provided during these difficult weeks. The groundskeeping staff, led by head gardener Mr. Thompson, worked extra hours to ensure that the gardens looked perfect for Camilla's final weeks there. They knew how much time she spent walking among the flowers and wanted her last memories of the palace grounds to be beautiful. Mr. Thompson even arranged for a cutting from Camilla's favorite rose bush to be prepared for transplanting to their new home. These gestures of kindness and support from palace staff meant more to Camilla than they could possibly know. In a situation where she often felt powerless and alone, these small acts of loyalty reminded her that their years at the palace had been meaningful and that they had touched people's lives in positive ways. Edward's final official engagements were particularly poignant. His last speech as a working royal was delivered at a veterans charity event, an organization he had supported for over a decade. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of people he had grown to know and respect over the years, Edward struggled to maintain his composure as he spoke about service, duty, and the importance of supporting those who had sacrificed for their country. After the speech, several veterans approached Edward privately to express their gratitude for his years of support and their sadness about his departure from royal duties. One elderly gentleman, a World War II veteran named Frank, pressed a small medal into Edward's hand, saying it belonged to someone who understood the meaning of service and sacrifice. Camilla's last official appearance was at a women's shelter that had been one of her most important patronages. She had helped secure funding for renovations, had visited regularly to support residents, and had worked tirelessly to raise awareness about domestic violence issues. The staff had prepared a small ceremony to thank her for her years of dedication, and several women who had been helped by the shelter's programs shared their stories of how Camilla's support had changed their lives. Among them was Maria, a young mother who had fled an abusive relationship with her two small children. When she first arrived at the shelter, she was terrified and hopeless, but Camilla's regular visits and genuine interest in her welfare had given her strength to rebuild her life. Maria was now working as a nurse and had her own apartment, and she credited Camilla's encouragement with helping her believe in herself again. These final official duties reminded Camilla of why she had found royal service so fulfilling despite its challenges. The opportunity to use her privileged position to help vulnerable people had given her life purpose and meaning. Facing a future without this platform for service left her feeling lost and uncertain about how to channel her desire to make a positive difference in the world. The final weeks also brought unexpected moments of reflection and clarity. Stripped of the constant demands and protocols of royal life, Camilla found herself thinking more deeply about what truly mattered to her. Family relationships, genuine friendships, and the simple joys of daily life took on new significance as she prepared to embrace a different way of living. She spent hours talking with her children about their hopes and fears for the future. These conversations revealed the strength and maturity that Alexandra and William had developed through this difficult experience. While she wouldn't have chosen this path for them, Camilla began to see that leaving the palace might offer her children opportunities for independence and authentic relationships that they couldn't have found within the royal system. As their departure date grew closer, Camilla realized that saying goodbye to the palace was really about grieving the life she had planned and learning to embrace uncertainty. The future was frightening because it was unknown, but it was also full of possibilities that she hadn't been able to consider while bound by royal protocols and expectations. The final week arrived with an emotional intensity that made every moment feel both infinite and fleeting. Camilla found herself moving through the palace in a state of hyper-awareness, trying to absorb every detail of the home she was about to leave forever. The familiar sounds that had once been background noise now seemed amplified and precious. The chiming of the grandfather clock in the main corridor, the distant sound of horses from the nearby stables, the gentle hum of activity that indicated a household full of purpose and history. Moving trucks had been scheduled for the following Monday, and the reality of their physical departure was becoming undeniable. Boxes labeled with careful handwriting filled every room, containing the accumulated treasures of 15 years of family life. Each packed item represented a memory, a moment of joy, or a piece of their identity that would need to find its place in their new reality. Camilla had been dreading the task of packing her personal study, the room where she had spent countless hours working on charitable projects, writing speeches, and responding to correspondence from people around the world. The mahogany desk where she had signed thousands of letters, the bookshelf filled with volumes on social issues and royal history, the filing cabinets containing records of her various initiatives, dismantling this workspace felt like erasing years of meaningful work. Among her papers, she discovered folders containing thank you letters from people whose lives had been touched by her charitable efforts. A letter from a young girl who had received a scholarship through one of Camilla's education programs, expressing how the opportunity had changed her family's future. A note from parents whose premature baby had received life-saving care at a hospital Camilla had supported, crediting her advocacy with improvements in neonatal services. These testimonies to the impact of her work provided some comfort during this difficult time, reminding her that her years of service had created lasting positive change. Edward was handling his own farewell process with characteristic stoicism, but Camilla could see the deep sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He had spent the week visiting various military units and veteran organizations, saying private goodbyes to people who had become friends over years of shared service. These men and women had welcomed him not because of his royal status, but because of his genuine commitment to their welfare and his respect for their sacrifices. Colonel James Morrison, who had worked closely with Edward on several veteran support initiatives, visited the palace for a final meeting. The two men had developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared values, and their farewell was particularly emotional. Colonel Morrison presented Edward with a framed photograph of a veteran housing project they had worked together to establish, signed by all the residents who had benefited from the program. The children were experiencing their own complex mix of emotions as they prepared for departure. Alexandra had been granted permission to invite her closest friend, Charlotte, for a farewell sleepover in her palace bedroom. The two girls stayed up late talking about their fears and hopes for the future, trying to make plans for maintaining their friendship despite the changing circumstances. Charlotte's parents had been supportive, but everyone understood that the political dynamics within the royal family would make their relationship more complicated going forward. William had become obsessed with creating detailed drawings of every room in their palace quarters, as if he could preserve their home through art. His sketches showed remarkable attention to detail for a 12-year-old, capturing not just the furniture and decorations, but also the feeling of each space. He drew his bedroom with careful attention to the placement of his model airplanes, his parents' sitting room with the family photographs arranged just as he remembered them, and the kitchen where the family often gathered for informal meals. Camilla found these drawings both heartbreaking and beautiful. They represented William's attempt to maintain some control over a situation that was completely beyond his influence, and they showed his deep attachment to the only home he had ever known. She made sure to pack his artwork carefully, understanding that these images might become important touchstones for his memories of this chapter of his life. The palace staff were going through their own process of adjustment and farewell. Many of them had worked for the royal family for decades and had rarely experienced such a significant departure. Mrs. Henderson, the children's nanny, was particularly struggling with the transition. She had declined offers of new positions within the royal household, feeling too emotionally connected to Camilla's family to simply transfer her loyalties to other employers. During her final week, Mrs. Henderson worked with Camilla to create detailed care instructions for the children, including their preferences, routines, and the best ways to support them through difficult moments. These notes would help whoever might care for Alexandra and William in the future, but creating them felt like writing an ending to a story that Mrs. Henderson wasn't ready to conclude. The head chef, Marcus, prepared special farewell meals for the family throughout the week, featuring everyone's favorite dishes and recreating memorable meals from important occasions in their past. He made Alexandra's birthday cake recipe just because she loved it, prepared William's favorite fish and chips exactly the way he preferred, and created an elaborate dinner for Camilla and Edward that included dishes from their wedding menu. These culinary tributes were Marcus's way of expressing his affection for the family and his sadness about their departure. Food had always been his language of care and love, and through these final meals, he was saying goodbye in the most meaningful way he knew how. Camilla was deeply moved by his thoughtfulness and made sure to request copies of all the family's favorite recipes to take with them. Dr. Thompson, the head gardener, had prepared a very special farewell gift for the family. Working quietly over several weeks, he had created a miniature garden in a large planter that contained cuttings and seeds from all of Camilla's favorite flowers in the palace gardens. This portable garden would allow her to take a piece of the palace grounds with her and establish familiar beauty in her new home. The gesture was particularly meaningful because Dr. Thompson had often worked alongside Camilla in the gardens, teaching her about plant care and listening to her dreams for expanding various garden areas. Their shared passion for horticulture had created a friendship that transcended their different roles within the palace hierarchy, and his gift acknowledged the genuine connection they had formed over the years. King Henry's absence during their final week was glaring and painful. Edward had hoped for at least a brief private meeting with his brother before their departure, an opportunity to attempt reconciliation or at least to achieve some form of closure. However, Henry remained unavailable and uncommunicative, apparently content to let their relationship end without any personal acknowledgement of what was being lost. This rejection was perhaps the most hurtful aspect of their entire situation for Edward. The political necessity of their departure was difficult enough to accept, but the personal coldness and complete abandonment of their family relationship felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any official decision ever could. Edward found himself grieving not just for their lost position, but for the brother he felt he no longer knew. Camilla watched her husband struggle with this emotional wound and felt her own anger toward Henry intensify. While she could understand the political pressures that might have influenced his decision, she couldn't comprehend how he could treat his brother's family with such callousness. The man who had once played with their children, who had shared family holidays and celebrations, had apparently erased all emotional connection to them. The children were also confused and hurt by their uncle's absence during this difficult time. They had grown up loving and respecting King Henry, and his sudden emotional withdrawal felt incomprehensible to their young minds. Camilla tried to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, emphasizing that sometimes adults make decisions that hurt people they care about, but her explanations felt inadequate even to herself. As the weekend arrived, bringing them to their final 48 hours in the palace, Camilla made a difficult decision to write a letter to King Henry. She wasn't sure if she would actually send it, but she felt compelled to express her feelings about their situation and to make one final appeal for understanding and reconciliation. The letter was carefully crafted, avoiding any language that could be interpreted as disrespectful or threatening. Camilla expressed her gratitude for the years they had been allowed to serve the crown, acknowledged the challenges of modern monarchy, and requested only that Henry consider maintaining some form of relationship with his niece and nephew. She emphasized that whatever disagreements existed between the adults shouldn't prevent the children from knowing their extended family. Writing the letter proved to be unexpectedly cathartic. Even if Henry never read it or responded, the process of articulating her thoughts and feelings provided Camilla with some sense of closure. She had said what she needed to say, and whatever happened next would be beyond her control. The final weekend was designated as family time, with no official appointments or obligations to distract from their need to process their emotions together. They spent Saturday morning walking through all their favorite areas of the palace grounds, sharing memories and taking final photographs. The autumn weather was crisp and beautiful, with golden light filtering through the trees and creating the kind of magical atmosphere that had made the palace feel like a fairy tale setting during their happiest years there. They visited the small chapel where they had attended services for 15 years, where the children had been confirmed, and where the family had found spiritual comfort during various challenges over the years. The chaplain, Father Michael, offered to meet with them privately, and they spent an hour in quiet conversation and prayer, seeking peace and strength for the journey ahead. That evening, the family gathered in their private sitting room for what they knew would be their last quiet evening together in the palace. They ordered pizza instead of requesting a formal meal from the kitchen, wanting this final night to feel relaxed and normal. They played board games, watched a favorite movie, and simply enjoyed being together without the weight of royal obligations or public scrutiny. As bedtime approached, both children asked if they could sleep in their parents' room, wanting to stay close during these last hours in their childhood home. Camilla and Edward agreed, understanding their need for comfort and connection. The four of them spent the night together, sometimes talking quietly about their hopes and fears, sometimes just lying in comfortable silence, drawing strength from their family bond. Sunday morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood that had settled over the family. This was their last day, and every activity felt weighted with finality. They attended one final service in the palace chapel, where Father Michael offered special prayers for travelers and for those beginning new journeys. His words provided some comfort, reminding them that endings can also be beginnings, even when the future is uncertain. The afternoon was spent on final packing and last-minute preparations for Monday's departure. Camilla found herself moving slowly through each task, reluctant to complete the process that would make their leaving irreversible. Every closed box felt like another step toward a future she wasn't ready to embrace. As evening approached, palace security informed them that media attention outside the gates had intensified, with photographers and reporters gathering to document their departure. The thought of their private grief becoming public spectacle added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. Edward made the decision to request additional security assistance for Monday morning, not because they expected any danger, but because he wanted to protect his children from excessive media attention during what would already be an emotionally difficult day. Sunday night, Camilla walked alone through the palace one final time. She visited every room that had been part of their family's daily life, saying private goodbyes and trying to imprint the memories permanently in her heart. In Alexandra's empty room, she remembered bedtime stories and homework sessions. In William's space, she thought about the excited conversations about his latest historical discoveries. In the kitchen, she recalled family breakfasts and late-night conversations with Edward. Standing in the main hallway, surrounded by portraits of royal ancestors, and looking toward the grand staircase she had climbed thousands of times, Camilla finally allowed herself to cry. Tomorrow would bring the hardest day of all, and she knew she would need every ounce of strength to support her family through their departure. But tonight, in the privacy of their soon-to-be former home, she grieved for everything they were losing and everything that would never be the same again. Monday morning arrived with a finality that felt like the weight of the world pressing down on Camilla's shoulders. She woke before dawn, not from any alarm but from the restless anxiety that had made sleep nearly impossible. The palace was unnaturally quiet, as if even the building itself was holding its breath before this momentous departure that would change everything for everyone involved. The moving trucks were scheduled to arrive at 8 o'clock, and palace security had coordinated with local police to manage the media presence outside the gates. Camilla could already hear the distant sounds of photographers and reporters gathering, their equipment being set up to capture every moment of what they undoubtedly viewed as a dramatic fall from grace. The thought of her children being subjected to this public scrutiny during their most vulnerable moments made her feel sick with protective fury. Edward was already up and dressed when she found him in their sitting room, staring out the window at the gardens they would never again call their own. His face showed the strain of the past months, new lines around his eyes, and a weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. They stood together in silence, holding hands, and watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft pastels, knowing this would be their last morning in the home where they had built their life together. The children appeared around 7, both looking pale and anxious despite their efforts to seem brave. Alexandra had packed her most precious belongings in a special bag that she refused to let anyone else handle, including her grandmother's jewelry box and a collection of photographs from happier times. William carried his favorite stuffed animal, something he hadn't done in years, and kept asking questions about exactly when they would leave and how long the drive would take to their new house. Mrs. Henderson arrived early to help with the final preparations, her eyes red from crying but her demeanor professionally composed. She had prepared special breakfast bags for the children, knowing they might not want to eat much, but hoping familiar foods would provide some comfort during the journey. Her thoughtfulness during this difficult morning was typical of the care she had shown the family for years. The moving crew arrived precisely on time, their efficiency and professionalism somehow making the situation feel even more surreal. These strangers walked through the family's private spaces, handling their intimate belongings with careful indifference, reducing 15 years of memories to items on an inventory list. Camilla found it difficult to watch as furniture that had been part of their daily lives was wrapped in blankets and carried away by people who had no understanding of its emotional significance. The children's beds were among the first items loaded onto the trucks, somehow making their departure feel more irreversible. William stood in his empty bedroom, looking lost and small in the space that had been his sanctuary. Alexandra tried to maintain her composure, but Camilla could see her daughter's hands shaking as she watched her personal belongings disappear into boxes and trucks. Palace staff members found reasons to walk past their quarters throughout the morning, offering quiet words of support and expressing their sadness about the departure. These brief interactions provided some warmth during an otherwise cold and administrative process. Marcus appeared with a thermos of hot chocolate for the children. Dr. Thompson brought one last bouquet of flowers from the garden, and several housekeeping staff members offered hugs and best wishes. The head of palace security, Commander Phillips, arrived to coordinate their departure and ensure their safety during what was expected to be a media circus outside the gates. He had worked with the family for over a decade and was clearly struggling with the professional requirement to treat their departure as a routine security matter rather than the personal tragedy he knew it to be. Commander Phillips explained the departure protocol in detail. Their personal car would be escorted by security vehicles through the palace gates and directly to their new home. The route had been carefully planned to minimize media exposure, though he warned that photographers would likely follow them and attempt to capture images at their destination. He assured them that additional security would be stationed at their new house for the first few days to help them adjust to their reduced protection status. As the morning progressed, more boxes disappeared into trucks, and their quarters began to look like empty shells of the warm family home they had been. Camilla walked through each room one final time, checking for forgotten items, but really saying goodbye to the spaces where she had experienced some of the happiest and most meaningful moments of her adult life. In the children's playroom, she remembered countless hours of games and art projects, birthday parties, and quiet afternoons when they were sick. The kitchen held memories of family breakfasts and late-night conversations, holiday preparations, and simple, everyday meals that had anchored their family routines. Her study contained echoes of important phone calls, fundraising planning sessions, and the quiet work of correspondence that had connected her to people around the world. Edward's study was being packed by professional handlers who treated his books and papers with care, but no understanding of their personal significance. His archaeological journals from university, family photographs spanning generations, and correspondence with colleagues and friends were reduced to items in boxes. The room where he had worked on speeches, planned charitable initiatives, and found refuge from the pressures of royal life would soon be repurposed for whoever next occupied these quarters. The most difficult moment came when palace officials arrived with paperwork requiring Edward's signature to formally relinquish their residence rights. The legal language was precise and cold, officially terminating their 15-year tenancy and transferring responsibility for the quarters to the royal household for reassignment. Signing these documents felt like signing away their identity and their children's birthright. As noon approached, the last of their belongings were being loaded onto the moving trucks. The family gathered in what had been their sitting room, now empty except for the Persian rug they were leaving behind because it belonged to the royal collection. The space looked so different without their furniture and personal touches that it was hard to believe they had ever called it home. Mrs. Henderson made one final round of the quarters, checking every room and cupboard to ensure nothing important had been forgotten. She had prepared a special box of items for each family member: photo albums, favorite books, and small mementos that she thought might provide comfort during their transition. Her attention to these details showed the depth of her care and her understanding of how difficult this departure would be. The children said their final goodbyes to Mrs. Henderson, and the emotion of this parting finally broke through Alexandra's carefully maintained composure. The teenager cried openly as she hugged the woman who had been a second mother to her, and even William abandoned his brave facade as he clung to the person who had cared for him since he was a toddler. Edward shook hands formally with the palace officials who had overseen their departure, maintaining his dignity even as they treated this moment as a routine administrative matter. The contrast between the human emotion of the situation and the bureaucratic efficiency of the process highlighted how completely the royal system could separate personal relationships from institutional requirements. Camilla found herself standing in the main hallway of their former home, looking toward the front door that would take them away from everything they had known. The family portraits that had lined the walls were now packed away, leaving pale rectangles on the wallpaper where they had hung. The grandfather clock that had chimed the hours of their family life had been carefully moved to storage. Everything that had made this space their own had been erased. Commander Phillips approached to inform them that it was time to leave. The media presence outside had grown significantly, and he recommended departing soon to avoid further escalation. Their personal car was waiting in the courtyard, and the security escort was ready to provide safe passage through what was likely to be an aggressive crowd of photographers and reporters. The walk from their former front door to the waiting car felt both endless and instantaneous. Each step carried them further from the life they had built and closer to an uncertain future. Palace staff members had lined the corridor to see them off, their faces showing the sadness and awkwardness of the moment. These people had been part of their daily lives for years, but protocol prevented any emotional displays during this formal departure. Camilla carried herself with as much dignity as she could manage, knowing that her children were watching and learning from her example. She held William's hand tightly, while Edward supported Alexandra, and together they walked through the palace corridors one final time. The echo of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the formal silence. As they approached the main entrance, the sound of the crowd outside became audible through the heavy doors. Voices calling questions, cameras clicking, and the general chaos of media attention waiting to document their departure. Commander Phillips briefed them one final time about the process, emphasizing the importance of getting to their car quickly and avoiding any response to shouted questions. The palace doors opened, and they stepped into a wall of noise and flashing lights that was overwhelming in its intensity. Photographers pushed forward despite security barriers, shouting Camilla's name and calling for reactions to their departure. Questions were yelled from the crowd about their feelings, their future plans, and their relationship with King Henry, but the family maintained their silence and focused on reaching their car. Camilla instinctively moved to shield her children from the aggressive media attention, positioning herself between them and the cameras while Edward guided them toward their vehicle. The distance to the car couldn't have been more than 50 yards, but it felt like crossing a battlefield under enemy fire. The invasion of their privacy during this most vulnerable moment felt like a final insult added to their institutional rejection. William stumbled slightly under the pressure of the crowd and the chaos, and Camilla's protective instincts overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Seeing her 12-year-old son frightened and overwhelmed by adult strangers shouting at him, and taking his picture without permission finally, broke through her reserves of dignity and restraint. She turned toward the crowd of photographers and reporters, her face showing all the pain, anger, and grief she had been suppressing for months. For a moment, her mask of royal composure completely slipped, revealing the raw human emotion of a mother protecting her children and a woman whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. The vulnerability and desperation in her expression was captured by dozens of cameras, creating the image that would define public memory of their departure. This moment of emotional breakdown was exactly what the media had been hoping to capture, and the intensity of their response to her distress only highlighted the cruelty of the entire situation. Edward quickly moved to support his wife, helping her regain her composure and continue their movement toward the car. The children looked frightened by seeing their mother, usually so strong and controlled, showing such raw emotion in public. They finally reached their vehicle, and security personnel helped them get inside, while continuing to shield them from the aggressive media attention. As their car pulled away from the palace gates, Camilla looked back one final time at the building that had been their home, their workplace, and their identity for 15 years. The sight of photographers still taking pictures through the car windows made her turn away and focus on comforting her children for the journey ahead. The drive to their new house took them through London streets that were familiar, yet somehow different when viewed from the perspective of private citizens rather than working royals. The security escort gradually peeled away as they left the immediate vicinity of the palace, leaving them with just one protection officer for the remainder of their journey. Their new house was modest compared to their palace quarters, but comfortable and welcoming. It had been cleaned and prepared for their arrival, and some of their furniture had already been delivered and arranged by the moving crew. Walking into this new space felt strange and unfamiliar, but it also represented possibility and the chance to build a different kind of life together. The children explored their new bedrooms while Camilla and Edward stood in their new living room, holding each other and processing the magnitude of what they had just experienced. They had survived their departure from the palace, maintained their dignity despite the media circus, and successfully protected their children through the most difficult day of their lives. As evening approached and the chaos of the day began to settle, Camilla realized that while they had lost their royal role and their palace home, they still had each other. Their family bond had been tested by this crisis, but had proven to be stronger than any institutional rejection or public humiliation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and perhaps they would discover strengths and opportunities they never could have found within the constraints of royal life. The breaking down she had experienced at the palace gates was not just about grief for what they had lost, but also about the overwhelming relief of finally being able to show authentic emotion after months of maintaining a facade of dignified acceptance. In losing everything they thought defined them, they had perhaps found the freedom to discover who they really were beyond their titles and roles.